Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us today as we kick off this year's first installment of the UNCG Military Leadership Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Beth Carlin, and I am Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement here at UNCG and coordinator of our Military and Veteran Alumni Network, which is a dynamic and ever-growing community here in the Greensboro area and beyond. I'm also a Senior Chief Petty Officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve with almost 19 years of service. And so I am just terribly excited to introduce our speaker today, Captain William Toti, U.S. Navy retired, a 7-time Legion of Merit recipient. Captain Toti has had such a long, successful, and notable career that it's difficult to know where to begin in introducing him, but I am going to try. He spent his 26-year naval career as a submarine officer, serving as the CO of the USS Indianapolis submarine from 1997 until her decommissioning in 99, followed by a tour as Commodore of Submarine Squadron. While serving on board the Indianapolis, he was instrumental in setting in motion an investigation that would ultimately lead to the exoneration of the captain of the cruiser Indianapolis, which was sunk by a Japanese submarine during World War II. He also served more than 9 years at the Pentagon, including an assignment as Special Assistant to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, and he was on duty at the Pentagon during the September 11th attacks of 2001. Captain Toti went on after retirement to a successful career in the defense industry, most recently serving as CEO of the Spartan Corporation. Since leaving that role, he wrote a book, From CO to CEO, telling the story of his journey in transition from a successful military career to a successful civilian career, something that anyone who has undergone that process can tell you is easier said than done. The book not only tells his own story, but brings to light many of the obstacles one might encounter and corrects some of the myths and mistaken impressions that service members often take away from transition assistance programs that the military sponsors. He has a wealth of knowledge about how to find success in any sector, and we are so pleased to have him speak to us today. Now, before I hand it off to him, I did just want to note that we will be taking Q&A after his talk. So please use the chat or the Q&A function to ask questions or make comments, and we will bring those forward at the end. We will also be doing a drawing to give away copies of the book to 3 of you, and we'll announce the winners after the Q&A, so make sure you stay until the end. And so without further ado, I will hand it off to Captain Toti, sir.
Thank you, Beth. I'm very grateful to be here and talk to all of my friends at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So unusual today, and I apologize in advance because I'm going to be giving a talk that I've never given before. Normally, I'm asked to talk about one of those 3 topics that Beth brought up. Today I spend most of my time talking about veterans transitioning in industry. I spent a lot of time speaking to companies about how to prepare their veterans to work well in industry. Sometimes I am asked to talk about my role in the exoneration of USS Indianapolis Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III. And not too often, but sometimes I am asked to talk about my experiences in the Pentagon on 9/11. To be honest with you, it was well over 15 years before I was able and willing to talk about 9/11. But then I started referring to it as the forgotten 9/11 because so few people know about the Pentagon that day. And so I decided it was my duty to, as a survivor, to keep people reminded of my friends who died. And so I did start in 2016 talking about that. But the problem is these 3 topics have nothing to do with each other. And so I rarely combine them into a single talk, because I always want to have a coherent theme. And of course, I want to sound coherent, which I may not sound today, but I'll do my best. And so your comments will inform me as to whether or not it came across as at least somewhat coherent. On the veteran issue, there's the military not only fails military folks that leave the military. The reason I talk about it so much is I've come to understand that the military actually sets our veterans up for failure when they leave active duty. And that's why I spent a lot of time talking about that. So the McVeigh affair, of course, is about the Navy setting McVeigh up as a scapegoat for its own failings, and then for over 50 years failed to acknowledge its failings and correct its mistakes. On the Pentagon, I would say that the issue is one where the military failed to anticipate and prepare for an event that could have and should have been contemplated. Because after all, 9/11 was a domestic terrorist attack using over 50-year-old World War II Japanese kamikaze tactics. And it's just a simple fact that Al-Qaeda was a better student of history than we were. And we could have seen those Japanese kamikaze tactics modified for the modern world, and we failed to do it. So what order should I talk about these subjects in? If I were to discuss them in order of severity, obviously I'd talk about 9/11 first, because 9/11, December 7th, and the Civil War were the three greatest threats to our country in all of our history. If I were to talk about them in the order of number of people directly affected, maybe I'd talk about the veteran employment issue first, because 200,000 veterans transition out of the military each year, and statistics show that about half of them fail to transition well. So it's 100,000 people a year. But then there's the Indianapolis story. It's just a story about one man. Or is it? Like many of you, the first time I heard the story of Indianapolis was when I saw the movie Jaws. For me, it was when I was a plebe at Annapolis. I was later lucky enough to be assigned to the submarine USS Indianapolis for 3 separate tours, as a junior officer, as department head, and last as captain. I think that most people know that Captain McVeigh was court-martialed in December 1945 for hazarding his ship by not zigzagging when it was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-58. He lost around 900 of his 1,200-man crew when the ship was sunk, the largest loss of life from any single ship sinking in U.S. Navy history. Many people also know that he was the only captain in history of a Navy ship to be court-martialed after his ship was sunk in war. For decades after the court-martial, he received hate mail from family members of the lost at sea, his lost crew members. After all, his own Navy convicted him and seemed to blame him for the loss of his ship. Why should the family members think otherwise? The survivors of the sinking began taking up his cause at their first reunion in 1960, when I was just 3 years old. Unfortunately, he took his own life in 1968. Suicide is often called a permanent solution to a temporary problem, but it had been well over 2 decades since his ship's sinking, and he was still getting this hate mail. From his point of view, there was nothing temporary about this. Over the decades after his suicide, the survivors took up the cause more vigorously and engaged the president, the Navy, Congress, and anyone who would listen to try to get his conviction overturned. Irregularities were uncovered. Procedural violations were revealed. Extenuating circumstances were discovered. The Navy's 1945 pronouncements on the matter were revealed to be lies. And for over 50 years, the Navy was tone deaf on all of this. Then in 1995, a 13-year-old boy decided to take up the case, receiving national coverage. The boy brought new visibility and attention to the case But being a boy, he got many of the facts and details of his narrative wrong or out of context. The Navy used the fact that the boy was getting the facts wrong as an excuse to not act on them and remain tone deaf, ignoring the fact that the issue was receiving national exposure and an increasingly dynamic storyline. And instead of focusing on the boys, and it focused on the boys' error of fact, rather than the larger landscape that was being revealed. It was that time in 1998 when the Indianapolis survivors pulled me into their campaign to exonerate McVeigh. I was finishing up my captain tour on USS Indianapolis, and their excuse was I was a submarine captain, so I could evaluate the Japanese submarine's attack with a studied eye. So I started working, I would say reluctantly working on the case because I wasn't sure what I would learn, and I wasn't actually sure I would be able to help them. Later, I was transferred to the Pentagon working for the Vice Chief of Naval Operations. But during that time, what I was able to do that nobody had done before was analyze, using computer modeling, the Japanese submarine's attack, assuming the Indianapolis had been zigzagging. They couldn't have done that in 1945 during the court-martial. And by doing this computer modeling of the torpedo attack, I was able to determine that within 95% probability that even if this Indianapolis had been zigzagging, it would have still been struck by at least one torpedo. And being a submariner, I knew that once the ship was hit by one, it's easy to reposition and hit it by follow-on torpedoes. In other words, one way or another, the ship was going to go down. In other words, Captain McVeigh didn't hazard his ship by not zigzagging. In other words, he was innocent of the charges. Unfortunately, I was working for the Navy staff at this time, having just left my job as CO of the submarine. And of course, the survivors wanted me to go public with all this and reveal the Navy's flaws. This put me in the uncomfortable position of working both against my boss and my service. So I decided instead to work behind the scenes with members of Congress and their staff to feed them the analysis, to reinforce the notion that what they were doing in trying to pass a law that exonerated McVeigh was the right course of action. That exoneration passed in the year 2000, and I was proud to enter the exoneration language into McVeigh's service record in May of 2001, when the survivors insisted that I be the one to do it, and they wouldn't trust that it was done unless I told them it was done. You know, this all was covered, including my role, was covered in the 2018 book titled Indianapolis by Lynn Vincent and Sarah Vladeck, two wonderful researchers. And these two ladies did a magnificent job exposing information that had never been exposed. There have been 9 or 10 books written on the Indianapolis since 1945. And when they said they were going to write this book, my honest opinion was there's nothing left to find. But by going to National Archives and going to primary sources and helping them translate Navy into English, it turns out there was a lot left to find, even 50, 60 years after the events. And so I really thank those ladies for getting the story out in a way that had never been told before. And the other message is that a single person, this time that 13-year-old boy, can indeed make a difference in a long-held historical narrative. Now, moving on to the work I'm doing today on a daily basis is what I spent my days doing. While a hiring manager in one of my civilian jobs, one day I hired a veteran into a leadership position. I was really excited about it. I was excited to take him from the military into this position, and I was excited to have a veteran serving in a role that no veteran in our company had served in before. But within a few months, it became very clear to me that I'd made a mistake. This veteran was not doing well in that role. He was floundering. Now, I tried to take him under my wing, mentor him to the extent I could, but he just wasn't learning right. He just wasn't learning to the degree I had every wish and hope and expectation that he would. And we had to let him go. And that's not supposed to happen, right? Veterans are supposed to do superhuman things. And hiring them, that's supposed to make us all feel good. And here's a bit of a secret. All military officers believe going into their civilian jobs that they're already great leaders. I know I did. In fact, when I transitioned, I was told something by my transition training course instructors that I now refer to as the great lie. And the great lie is this: all your futures want from you, all your future employers want from you is good leadership. We want to believe that because we think we're good leaders. And if that's all they want, then we're set up for success, right? Well, maybe not. Because if we gave it even a moment's worth of thought, that's not even true in the military. If all the military needed from us is good leadership, you could take a submarine captain like me, put him in command of an Air Force fighter wing, and I'd do just fine. But in fact, even in the military, good leadership isn't enough because you actually have to know something about what we call the tactics, techniques, and procedures of running that military operation. Why would it be any less true in industry? You have to know something about the industry you're joining, and no amount of good leadership is going to get around that hard fact. And there's another thing, and it has to do with the style of leadership. As I often say to my active duty friends, leadership is hard, but it's even harder when you're leading people who can actually quit. And that's not a problem I ever had when I was captain of a submarine. My crew might have disagreed with my decisions, but in final analysis, there was no place for them to go. And that's true for most military units. The point I'm making here, and I'll continue to make throughout this presentation, every time I talk to folks, is that military folks don't transition to industry with an innate understanding of how to succeed in business. They have to be taught just like everyone else. And the leadership skills they developed on active duty may not translate well to industry. As I said, statistics show that about half of veterans leave their first civilian job within 2 years of transitioning into industry. It's in fact the number is 65%. Companies waste millions of dollars a year recruiting, hiring, and doing some basic training, trying to fit square pegs into round holes. And that costs them real money. So I try to address both sides of the coin. I talk to a lot of veteran groups and tell them the truth about the challenges that they're going to face when they transition to industry, because the truth is the military is going to lie to them when they make that transition. And they're going to face some of the hardest challenges they faced in their professional career. But they're also going to offer some great benefits to the companies that hire them if they learn how to become a square peg fitting into a square hole. When you join your first company, I tell people there's going to be some 26-year-old employee who knows more, way more than you do about what the company needs to do to be successful. In Navy language, that 26-year-old is a lieutenant. In the Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, he or she'd be a captain. That makes you, the veteran who's just transitioned to the first job, a second lieutenant all over again. Doesn't matter if you transition as a general. When you join that company, in your mind, you've got to accept the point that you're a second lieutenant over again. And that, if you come in with that attitude, you have a chance of succeeding. In my industry jobs, I had thousands of employees. I'd say maybe 10 to 15% of them were veterans. And many of those veterans didn't transition well. I did what I could, but there were so many of them, they way outnumbered me. I was trying to solve the problem one individual at a time, and it wasn't working. There are too many. So I looked for a book that I could recommend to veterans as they prepared to transition. But every book I found, and I tried reading them all, was either hand-waving pablum, how to be a good leader, create a vision, communicate the vision. Yeah, you've read that 1,000 times. It's no different than any civilian leadership book you might have read. Or it was written by somebody who never actually had to do with what we all had to do to succeed in industry, because they were a transitioning general or admiral that was handed their job because of who they were, not what they had done in industry. Or it was a headhunter who thinks they know what the transitioning veteran candidate needs to do to succeed, but has never actually been a hiring manager, has never actually had employees who are veterans in industry, has never actually had to develop that training program for that veteran to succeed. But of course, they were happy to give their opinion. What I couldn't find was a book written by a career veteran hiring manager with advice to both companies and military leaders who wanted to become corporate leaders, that had practical nuts and bolts advice on what I've learned, and I've failed too. So what I've learned through success and failures in my transition on my way to becoming a CEO. I didn't want to write this book. It took 2 years of my life. Part of it while I had a day job, so I was doing it on nights and weekends. And the day job was as CEO, so it was a very taxing day job. And part of it, after I decided, you know what, I can't keep trying to juggle both my day job and this other effort. It's not fair to my company. And I decided a year ago this month to retire from my CEO job and devote full time to get my book finished, get it published, which was done last April. But it also required a great deal of my own personal money, tens of thousands of my own dollars, because believe it or not, those of you that have written books know this, publishing companies are not falling over new authors trying to grab your book to publish them. They want new authors to put skin in the game in the form of dollars and marketing and all those other things, because if they think you're not committed to the book's success, then they're not going to invest in the book's success either. And it costs a lot of money. So 2 years and a lot of my own dollars, to the point where I'm never going to break even on this book. That's not the point of it. Not why I wrote it. It's not my expectation. But I do believe it make the most impact in my life of anything that I've done, most impact on the most people. And I think it's the right thing to do, is to share these experiences. And I hope the book does that. And those of you that will receive a free one today, feel free to reach out to me via my website and tell me whether or not you think it actually gets that done. So that's the veteran transition to industry bit of the talk. And that brings us to 9/11. As I said, I call the Pentagon a forgotten 9/11. I've been through so many experiences in my life. In the book, I say, serendipity finds you, you don't find it. Somebody once told me, look, if I wrote your life story as fiction, nobody would believe it. Nobody would buy it because it's so unbelievable. And I can't argue with that. It just happened to find myself in these situations over the course of my life, having to make decisions on what to do in the situation I found myself in. On 9/11, we knew the plane was inbound to DC before it hit. I surmised, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, when we knew the plane was inbound to DC, I said, what building in DC is easy to find by air? Because we'd watched the World Trade Center happen on TV in real time. What building in DC is easy to find by air, has some kind of symbolic value, and contains a lot of people? Each of the World Trade Centers had roughly 20,000 people. The only building in DC that met those three criteria was the Pentagon. And I was unwise enough to say those words out loud 2 or 3 minutes before the plane actually hit, which caused some people in my audience to begin freaking out. And I regretted it because I wasn't sure I believed it, even though my logical brain said, this makes sense. Maybe the emotional quotient part of me should have said, yeah, but keep it to yourself. But, 2 or 3 minutes later, heard the plane come in. You hear this airplane at full throttle. We're right next to Reagan National Airport, right? So you always hear airplanes at full throttle, but the difference is as those planes are taking off, the sound diminishes. This plane, clearly the sound was increasing, but I don't know. I didn't start a stopwatch. I'm guessing 10 to 15 seconds after we first heard it was when it impacted. And of course, you don't know where to go. You got 10 to 15 seconds of warning. Everybody just kind of stayed where they were. And then once the explosion happened and you realized you're alive, I realized that this was, the first thought in my head after I realized I was alive was, this is my Pearl Harbor moment. This is our Pearl Harbor moment. And I thought that what I did at this moment would impact me for the rest of my life in positive and negative ways, maybe way more negative than positive. So I ran to the point of impact. First, I ran inside the building. When I saw there was a hole in the building, I could see through smoke, sunlight, which is not a good sign. Ran down the steps and outside to the point of impact from the outside of the building. At first, the number of casualties greatly outnumbered those of us that had responded. And that's true. That was true probably for the first hour after the impact. And one of the things I didn't talk about for over 15 years was that as we were outnumbered by both walking wounded and people that could not self-rescue, that we had to carry away from the building, I looked up looking for help, hoping others were coming in. And I saw thousands of people running away, half of them in uniform. That infuriated me. And I couldn't talk about that for over a decade. That these military people were just running away. And I don't know even why I still tell the story. I guess I do because it's true on one hand. And on the other hand, people make assumptions about folks in uniform, and many of those assumptions may not be true. But, I stayed to do what I could throughout the day. And it was well about an hour before there was really not much for us to do, but I didn't want to leave. Excuse me. I stayed just thinking and hoping that there was something we could do because the plane hit the Navy Command Center and I had a lot of friends in there. And I was hoping for some miracle that we would find people alive, a pocket of folks, and it just didn't happen. And eventually I ran out of adrenaline and had to find a way home. And that's another story entirely. I've lived with over 20 years now with physical ailments. I still suffer from chronic lung disease and survivor's guilt ever since that day. So as I said, more negatives than positive. But one lesson I took away from that day that is very positive is you can be an important and effective leader even when you have no actual authority as a leader. And I'm not talking about myself. The authority for responding to this crisis lay with Arlington County because the Pentagon is located in Arlington County. And decades earlier, the Pentagon had given Arlington County responsibility for responding to things like fires, ambulance calls, and things like that. Nobody had ever anticipated a crisis of this magnitude when they handed that authority over to Arlington County. But Arlington County had the authority to respond and to manage the response, but they didn't have the capability. Unlike New York, where almost everybody worked for the municipal government of New York and the mayor, at the Pentagon, dozens of federal, state, and local entities responded, all working for a different chain of command with nobody in charge. And many of them didn't want to admit or subordinate themselves to a smaller district, municipality of Arlington County. Fairfax County had way more capability than Arlington County. And so everybody was doing their own thing. Nobody ever had experience managing a crisis of this size. But eventually, over an hour into the event, a single Army 3-star showed up onto the field named John Van Alstyne, who had no actual authority. The military had zero authority, believe it or not, to respond to this, but he was able to herd the cats through the force of personality, through his calmness and his ability to manage large-scale efforts. And everybody just kind of fell into place, even though he had no authority. It was a wonderful example of the impact of informal leadership, an example that stuck with me throughout my life. So I guess that's it. I mean, 3 completely discrete, disparate subjects with no congealing theme, just like I promised you at the beginning, right? There's no way I can think of, maybe you can think of a way to combine these all into one coherent talk. I haven't been able to do it. So 3 separate subjects. I did my best. That's the end of my talk, and I'm happy to answer questions. So over to you, Beth.
Thanks so much, sir. That was awesome. No, I think if we were the first audience for this particular talk and attempt, I think it was a success. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So yeah, we will roll into our Q&A portion. So I'll go ahead and just jump right in, sir.
Okay.
So we have one question from John David. Good afternoon, Captain. This is Chief John David Blair, fellow chief. Awesome. I transitioned from active duty to civilian reserve duty in 2011. As a maintenance supervisor, one of the challenges I found during my transition was expectations of tasks and how I spoke to my maintenance technicians. My manager at the time, a retired senior chief, said I needed to work on my softer skills on how I approach and speak to my technicians. Do you discuss this in your book, and how do you address it?
I do, actually. So John, glad to hear from you. And I did many chief promotion ceremonies over the course of my career. I don't think we call them chief initiation ceremonies anymore. I don't know. They're way softer these days, I assume, than they were when I did my first one 30 some years ago. But I do talk about that in the book. Early in my industry career, as one of the few transition veterans who was in a leadership position in the company, in this business unit within the company, I was asked to sit in on a lot of interview sessions where we were trying to hire transitioning veterans, as well as termination sessions. And one of the very first termination sessions I was asked to sit in on was, believe it or not, a retired 1-star general. And I won't mention the service. And the reason he was being terminated was because he lacked those softer skills. And it became one of those old dog, new tricks kind of things. And this actually, it was during this conversation, his boss and I were having with him, where I came up with this saying that I've used ever since, which is, leadership is hard, but it's even harder when you're leading people who can actually quit. Because he was his unit, his people were quitting, right? They were voting with their feet. And so, you know, I do talk about the fact that you can't lose the way I address it in the book is something called situational leadership. I'm not suggesting military leaders lose those take charge, directive, control. By the way, the civilian community calls that leadership style command and control style. We military leaders think of the expression command and control as meaning something completely different than what civilians mean when they say command and control. But when they say you're exhibiting command and control leadership style, they mean you're acting like a military leader barking out orders. And that is not a good thing. In industry, people vote with their feet, something you can't do when you carry an active duty card. And you've got to learn how to bring your people along with you, not direct them, force them, or order them. Bring them. It's a more coaching leadership style. And if you don't develop that style and learn how to adapt, it's not going to go well. So I talk about this a lot with transitioning veteran groups. If I say there's the one thing you need to learn how to do, is learn how to lead the right way for industry, for your new environment. Learn the new culture. If you don't get that right, no amount of knowledge that you have in maintenance supervision is going to save you. Does that help?
That's very good, sir. Yeah, that a lot of that really sort of resonates with me. I think everyone sort of goes through their own process, you know, and has to sort of navigate those tone shifts, you know, that aren't immediately apparent when you're coming into a new organization or role. So I think everyone sort of has to navigate that for themselves, but that's a big help. Thank you, sir. All right, so we've got another question from Stephanie Weber. When I transitioned out of the military and was job searching, I found that when I put my military experience on my resume, I received no interest from employers, so I removed it. As a female Marine veteran, I can maybe understand. In your experience or from what you may have heard, can previous military experience actually hinder the job search process?
It can, depending on which kind of company you're looking for, which industry you're looking for. Because and I talk about this in the book too, you're going to deal with some people who are stuck in their stereotypes. One of the expressions I heard for the first time, I was actually a vice president in a defense company when I heard this. And I overheard my boss talking to HR about a candidate for a position of leadership in the company. And he asked the vice president of HR, is this candidate a freeloader? And I was dumbfounded. I had no idea what he was talking about. It's obviously a very derogatory expression, right? Freeloader. And the vice president of HR, I was actually walked in the room. I was sitting behind my boss. The vice president of HR could see that I was sitting in the room behind my boss, and her eyes went wide. And I knew, okay, he doesn't know I'm here. This is probably not good. And she feigned to not understand what he was talking about. And rather than say, deflected some other way, because I think she was just as shocked as I was. He said, you know, freeloader, retired military. And, you know, because, you know, I joked, I spoke up at that point, realizing that I was the only retired military guy in the room. And I spoke up to make sure he knew I was there. And I laughed and I joked about it. No, Frank, I'm the only freeloader here. And they got really mad. And he got mad. When he got mad, I realized he wasn't joking, right? So there are going to be companies and employers who look at us veterans as yet just another diversity and inclusion group. We're going to hire enough veterans so that we're not flagged in our employment statistic as being anti-veteran. But there's so much retraining we need to do with those veterans that we don't want to hire any more than we have to. And that's going to be a problem. One other point that was made to me by a peer hiring manager who was not a veteran. Well, he kept asking me to sit in on his interviews with veteran candidates for work in his business unit. These people weren't going to be working for me. I had enough of my own employees to keep me busy. I kept wondering why he wanted me to sit on his too. I didn't have time for this. So eventually I said, no, Bob, why do you want me to do this? I mean, what's up with that? He says, well, you know, they keep saying things that I don't understand, and you understand what they're talking about. And you need to understand, the only thing I know about veterans is what I learned from watching the HBO miniseries Federation Kill. And I had not seen Federation Kill when he said that. And so I had to go back and watch Generation Kill. And after I watched it, I went back and said, Bob, you got to know that this is nothing like these. I mean, it's fictionalized, right? Maybe there's some truth to it. Maybe the way they talk is true. As Marines, I know the person who asked the question was a Marine, but this is not how people behave. You don't have to worry about this. And so if that's your stereotype of military folks, you're operating from the wrong frame of reference. But it had not occurred to me that that's what he was thinking when he thought military veteran. He was amused by the fact that I never swore, because everybody in Generation Kill swears, right? So what's wrong with you? You don't swear. You spent 26 years in the Navy. I thought all you guys were like that. And you don't drink like a drunken sailor? What's up with you? So we have to break the stereotype. And that's really hard to do sometimes. The second thing I'll tell you is that it drives me crazy in books. And when I see recruiters tell you, this is how you do your resume as a veteran. And they give you a formula for writing a resume. Let me tell you, there is no formula. The resume needs to be tailored to the position and the company you're applying to. There are going to be some companies and positions where you may want to eliminate your military experience. There are some companies and positions you may want to generalize, congeal, and summarize your military experience. And there are some companies and positions where it's going to be beneficial for you to outline everything. And then the other thing I tell people is don't civilianize it. I laugh when I read a resume where somebody says, I was chief executive officer of an infantry battalion. No, you weren't. And the fact that you say that, and by the way, I see Beth rolling her eyes. Let me tell you, that's what many recruiters will tell you to do. And it reveals ignorance on the part of a recruiter. They don't even, and the part of the candidate who's writing the resume, means neither of them know what a CEO really is. Because let me tell you, what I did as CEO is nothing like what I did as CEO. So the CEO of an infantry battalion role responsibilities are way different than a CEO of a company. And because you think you've civilianized the title, you're going to help people understand what you did. No, you're revealing your own ignorance. Because when I was CEO, I got to hire my people. Did that infantry battalion commander hire his or her people? I got to do a lot of things, create my budget, to decide how much I was spending. None of those skills are developed when you're CEO of a military unit. So again, there's a lot. I'm sorry, it's a rambling here, but the question is a great question. And the honest answer is your military experience will always help you perform in your job, always. as long as you learn the new culture and understand how to transition well. But the people reading the resume need to be fed that information the right way. And there's no single equation that's going to tell you what the right way is going to be. Long answer to a short question.
Thank you, sir. And I think we actually have a follow-up. How can veterans best use their military service to sell themselves in an interview, whether or not they have direct experience for the role they're interviewing for?
Yeah, great question. In the book, I actually addressed this. When I said earlier, I called something the great lie, that all your civilian company wants from you is leadership. No, that's not true. Okay, so what do they want? What do they want from your military experience? And I summarize it in the book. I call it that one thing. That one thing they want from you is an informed passion to learn. Okay, now what does that mean? Informed. They don't want you to dump all this knowledge that you gained during your military service experience. They want you to take that knowledge forward and have it inform your future life. That's the informed part. Otherwise, you're no different than that person straight out of high school or straight out of college who has no real life experience, right? So that's the informed part. You've got to be informed or you're the same as somebody who didn't serve. Passion. In the military, we say, embrace the suck. Like, what you're going to do is going to suck. Just embrace it, right? Because there's no way to get around it. So you might as well embrace it. In civilian world, what we call that is a fire in the belly, passion. You've got to do that. And everybody who's been in the military, who's gone through tough times, whether it was in combat or not, has that passion. And your civilian employer is going to want to see that from you. The mission's going to be different. The military defense of the United States is self-actualizing. Nobody needs to explain the mission to you. You know what it is. When you join a civilian company, they may need to explain the mission. You need to internalize that mission and make it yours and have a passion about that mission to perform. And if you do that, they're going to really be happy. The third thing is to learn. In the military, you change jobs every couple of years. You've had to learn a new job every time you change jobs, every time you PCS'd. That doesn't happen in the civilian world. You can spend 30 years in the same job in the civilian world if you want to. You can leave if you don't like it, right? But I've met many people who transitioned out of the military 30 years later. They were doing exactly the same job they were doing when they first transitioned. But for those of you that want, whoever leaves the military and starts that civilian job, the civilian employer should know that you're going to have to learn how to do that new job. Well, you've got plenty of experience learning how to do a new job every time you PCS'd, and you need to make that point and leverage that while you communicate, while you interview in your resume. And if you can communicate that informed passion to learn, 3 things, when you're going to be a must-hire kind of person. And so I really encourage you to think through that before you begin the application process.
Very good. Thank you, sir. I actually have a question I was hoping I could ask. In the book, you talk about age being a factor, right? Obviously we spend some time in the military, we get older, right? And then we go up for these positions in the civilian world that are maybe more entry level or closer to entry level than than our peer group, right? People going up for the same positions at that same stage of life are typically younger, right? So I think in the military we tend to sort of see that, or are encouraged to see that in these transitional assistance classes as seasoning, and that it will actually be a feature rather than a bug in the hiring process. Like, well,
Great way
you're
to put it.
seasoned, like that'll recommend you. And I think we all know how that goes. And in the book, you talk about a candidate's runway being a real concern, right? Like
Mhm.
the sort of um, you know, sort of trade-off, or you hire a candidate who's a little older, how much longer are they going to how long are they gonna give of their time and their career to your organization? And wouldn't you better hire somebody that's younger and can sort of invest more of their time and career? But I was wondering if you could sort of speak to how to get around that, like how to, imbue an employer with a sense of confidence that, I realize I'm older, I realize I'm not your traditional candidate, and, make it actually seem more like a feature. Yeah, even if even if there's problems there.
Yeah, I said same. My transition counselor actually gave me the same advice as you, right? Saying, well, if you've been a major commander, commanded a squadron of submarines, 6 submarines. If you made flag officer and you had even a greater level of responsibility, you'd be even more employable. And as I was approaching my mid-40s, I did some basic math. Well, most people retire around 65. I'm 45. That's 20 years. That's a career. If I've got 10 years, that's not a career. That's a job. So I better make the move now. I ignored the guy, right? And said, I better make that move now. And when I joined industry, it turns out I was right, he was wrong. That there is an issue. Now, age is a protected trait by law. So if I'm 45 and there's another candidate who's 35, the company can't hire the candidate because he's 35 and I'm 45 because of our age. Having said that, companies look at this matter as a return on investment question. If they're hiring you into a job where you're expected to perform immediately and there's no investment required by the company, you're going to start contributing from day one. For us military guys, it'd be like selling back to the Navy in a business development position. The company probably doesn't have to invest in me to do that. They may be fine with me being 45, but in the back of their mind, 55, in the back of their mind, they're thinking, it's probably going to stick around for 5 years. We can deal with that. And we'll have to hire somebody new. We like continuity, but he knows these people, and knowing these people gets you in the door, and that's important. So something like that, there's no return on investment question because they're not investing in you. If you want to take a job where the company is going to invest in you, they want to know that you're going to be around long enough for them to get a return on that investment. And I say this to my 30-something-year-old kids. If you change jobs every 2 years, your history shows, you don't, and not that they're doing that, by the way. If they watch this podcast, I don't want them to think I'm denigrating them, because I'm not. But if you change your jobs every 2 years, your employers are going to see that on your resume and think, well, I'm not going to spend any money on this person, because like history says, they're going to change their job in 2 years, right? Veterans suffer the same fate. On average, 65% change jobs within 2 years. So the company may not want to invest in you until you've been there long enough for them to know, okay, he's not going to jump ship. She's not going to jump ship. This is probably reasonable. So you have to have enough runway, future with that company, for them to get a return on that investment they're going to make in you. If you're approaching retirement age, their assumption is going to be you're going to retire when you hit retirement age. So the way you make it a feature instead of a bug is to convince them, don't lie, but tell them you're in this for the long haul. You're not going to be one of those career butterflies, fluttering from one flower to another. That you want stability, You're taking this job with the understanding that you want a career with this company. And will they 100% believe you? No, but they're hearing the things they need to hear to justify investing in you. And of course, you have all this experience that 35-year-old doesn't have, couldn't have ever received, just because they didn't have the jobs that you had. Not that they, they're too young. They never want to. There's another funny story. When I was in my first P&L position, I was director of an advanced technology division within a defense company. And I wanted to hire a new chief engineer. And the vice president of engineering, who was a peer of mine, no, he's too young. What do you mean he's too young? How old is he? He's 40. I said, when I turned 40, I was at sea in command of a nuclear submarine. I think he's just fine, right? And so there's the opposite side, where sometimes they'll think that a 40-year-old is too young for a certain job, but a 41-year-old is too old for another job. So you're going to find, it's not going to make sense. You're going to have to deal with it in a situational basis.
Well, I think that sort of awareness of the situation that you're going into is going to be key, and sort of tailoring your approach that way. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, sir. So we are winding down to the end, but really quick, I do just want to feed you one more question. So what roadblocks did you experience in your transition from CO to CEO, broadly speaking, and what support would have been beneficial?
Yeah, so this is going to sound paradoxical, but my first roadblock was created by the fact that you can get promoted really, really fast in industry. Okay. In the military, you got to wait your turn, your lineal number if you're an officer to come up. And then you get looked at by a board. I was in 05 for 6 years before I was, selected for 06. I was in 06 until I retired in 2000 to 2006, another 6 years, and then when I was in industry, I got promoted twice in the first 2 years. It was wonderful. It was exhilarating, but I probably got promoted to that second time too fast. And I wasn't self-aware enough to realize that I thought I deserved it. Silly me, right? And so I wasn't correcting the way I engaged with the company in a way that they were used to. I was doing the way I would have done based on my years of experience, but it wasn't the way the company did it. And so I was in the UK visiting one of my businesses, and it was early evening, and my boss's boss, who was in California, called me up. I was getting ready to go to bed, and he says, "Bill, you're screwing this up." So the obstacle was I was failing and didn't know it. And the reason I didn't know it is because I wasn't pinging on what we call a 360 today, right? And this was in the 2008 timeframe. I don't think we had adopted the expression 360 yet, but I wasn't inquiring with people all around me, bosses and subordinates. Hey, am I doing okay? What's different? And it turns out I was over communicating on matters that my peers were very furtive about. They were very close, keep their cards close to their chest because they don't want to reveal their weaknesses or their failings or their challenges, because that sets you up for political attacks. So I was over communicating on that stuff and not communicating enough on the stuff that they're used to hearing more about, and creating this perception that I was failing. When I finally did the 360 and started talking, and by the way, I took this really to heart because I assumed I was close to getting fired and didn't want that to happen. I said, what do I need to correct? Most of it was communications and creating a sense of confidence in my ability to operate at that level. At that point in my career, I was the only retired military guy running a multi-billion-dollar P&L in the company. So they weren't used to seeing guys like me doing work like that. And then when I didn't do the things they expected me to do and communicate in ways that they were used to hearing, they assumed it was because I was incapable, rather than it was my communication misunderstanding of the culture. So I was able to correct that. Good news. Went on to continue with my career, but that was really hard to overcome, and it was cultural. And so I keep harping on that culture issue, because not only is your civilian culture company going to be different from your military culture, but each division in your civilian company may have a different culture, and you need to be very sensitive to that and adapt to that wherever you go.
No, that is very true. Just because it's the same organization, I've found that, different sort of units and segments of a company or organization, you really have to sort of, readjust and assimilate to the way they do business there. So that's a really great point, sir.
By the way, it's the same in the military. Even when I was at the academy, the academic world, the English department culture was way different than the physics department culture. I was trying to do dual major English and physics, and the same methods didn't work with both. So there you go.
Yeah, no, they, on face value, I don't think they have much in common, but I think, I think there are some things you could make some arguments, but anyway, we do have to wrap up, everyone. Thank you so much to Captain Toti. We are so grateful to you for sharing your time and expertise, as well as your story with us today. You can find out more about Captain Toti's work at or purchase his book at williamtoti.com. And I do have our 3 winners to announce, and they are Nevea Barbie, Kenny Stewart, and Stephanie Weber. So if I called your name, please do send me an email with a mailing address for you where I can send the book, and we will have those in the mail this week. And my email address is in the chat if you need it. Sir, do you want to share your email address just in case anyone wants to?
It's actually very easy. It's william@williamtoti.com. You can see how it's spelled behind me there, I think. So just email william@williamtoti.com and it'll get to me. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. And we certainly hope you enjoyed this kickoff to our 2023 virtual speaker series. Please keep an eye out for future virtual events, and I hope to see everyone again soon. Thanks so much.
Take care.